Alright, in this video, this is part 2 to the MO2 and KITBASH tutorial series. There's a lot to talk about in this tutorial, but before we do that, with Black Friday approaching, bear in mind there are some sales going on. 30% off at MotionVFX, 50% off at KITBASH 3D, and then also at the CraftMath store you can get 50% off of my Abstract Pack, Fluid Pack, or the Snow and Dust Pack. Over at MotionVFX.com, use Black30 at checkout. Over at KITBASH3D.com, the sale is already applied. All you have to do is just purchase it. And then over at my website, www.bcraftmath.com, underneath the store, what you need to use here is the discount code CraftMath, no spaces, no caps, no quotes. And you can get 50% off the Fluid Pack, Abstract Pack, and the Snow and Dust Pack. So if you watched that intro video closely, and if you watched the one I posted yesterday in the MO2 Facebook group, maybe you did notice a difference, and Baby Yoda was in there. If you follow Beeple over on Twitter, he has a Baby Yoda model. It doesn't look exactly like this when we import it into MO2, but nonetheless, it does look nice in there anyway. Now this is free to download, and once you download it, I did actually use the FBX. I imported that directly into MO2, and I used the Legacy Material option. I tried all the other options as well. The FBX was the better way to go here, for MO2 purposes at least. Now, some of you may have already started building your KITBASH scene, and something I've ran across with rendering is Z-fighting or stitching. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Now, I have these two renders side by side, and they are coming directly from MO2 before I did anything in Final Cut Pro. And there's a few places here. Let me just go ahead and play this a little bit. And I'm going to fast forward, and I want you to look up here at this light. And I also want you to look over here at this yellow. This light, if I go forward and backward a few frames, you can see how we have some flickering up there. That little tiny square right there. Notice how it flickers as I go back and forth in my frames. And then also, if you look down here in this yellow region right there, you can see some flickering as well. Let me go forward and backward a few frames so you can see those two spots I'm talking about. Now, if I come over here to this scene, let me play it a little bit, and let me skip forward a few frames, we don't see any of that flickering going on. And there's a little adjustment we have to do here. And this is something called Z-fighting or stitching. And basically this happens whenever you have two or more objects that are pretty close or almost right on top of each other in the same position. Now you may wonder, okay, well, what is the fix for that? This has worked perfectly for me. Just by me moving it 0.001 or 0.01 or something like that in MO2, that flickering was gone. Now, a few other things that I've noticed about MO2 as well. You can experiment with this, but in your render settings, you can choose this sRGB or REC 709. I'm not very knowledgeable of this, but I did read in a Facebook post over in the MO2 group where this did solve some flickering as well. But just take note, when you change that, notice how it did make our scene a little bit darker. So maybe you'll have to compensate with some lights or something like that, going back and forth between these two settings here. Also, when you go to share your movie, here's what's worked for me. Now I'm going to tell you, when I'm making my final product, I'm actually doing at least 60 frames per second, and I'm also doing it at 4K, but for the sake of this tutorial and sake of speed, I'm just going to use 1920 by 1080 at 30 frames per second. But when you're making that final render, go ahead and do it at 4K and at least 60 frames per second, even more if you want, because when you go and import that into Final Cut Pro, you can start retiming things and all that good stuff. And then under the render settings, I select highest quality, but I come in here and I uncheck everything. If you leave this stuff checked, it's going to double, triple, or quadruple your render time, and I can't even tell a big difference, to be quite honest with you. I use the render settings in MO2 instead, with those recommendations, and my render times are just a matter of minutes, even at 4K. And these are for about 10-second clips. And now finally, let's talk about organizing this scene, this KITBASH scene. So I'm going to go ahead and hide my timeline. We would not need keyframes right now either. And I'll tell you what, since we've already started talking about this building, this is a perfect building to talk about setting things up. However, before I do that, what I want to do is I want to click on this entire scene that has all the buildings and towers inside of it. Let's frame that into view. And now what I want to do is I want to get some things out of the way, and then we can talk about building our scene. Something else that's important to note here, anytime I pan, dolly, or rotate the camera in perspective, if you hold the shift key while you're doing this, it will do those adjustments much faster. Switch on over to the wrench. And what I recommend doing here, these are some tips that I have learned that I wish I had applied when I first started messing around with this stuff. But I'm going to take all of these buildings and I'm going to drag them out of that group. Just make sure when you do this, you don't put one inside of the other. Now, I'm not going to delete that empty group here. I just find sometimes this is a quick way for me to, frame the entire scene again real quick. I'm just going to uncheck it. We don't need it right now. And what you want to do to start organizing your scene is, since we have pulled all of these towers out, and bear in mind in part one, we did verify that this building here, this tiny building where the army truck is, we did verify that the bottom of that building was sitting right on the plane. But since we have moved these buildings out of that group, if I click on Tower C, for example, notice Tower C is way over here, but yet the 3D gizmo is way over here on this side. And notice if I start moving the 3D gizmo around, notice the tower's moving. Well, we want this 3D gizmo to be right down here at the bottom of the tower, or at least in the center. We want it right smack in the middle, the core of that tower, if you will. So watch what happens now. I mean, even with the tower over here, if we go to its anchor point, and for the alignment, you can either select Set Center. That's going to put the 3D gizmo right in the center, the core of that tower, or you can set it to bottom. Now watch what happens. If we come up to the position X and Z, and we set these to 0, what that's going to do is it's going to put that tower right smack in the middle of that plane. It's right in the middle of this scene. That's perfect. Now we can just go ahead and move this tower out of the way. And let's go and do all of these in order before we work on a building. So let me show that to you one more time. Tower F, the 3D gizmo right now is in the center of the scene, but we want the 3D gizmo to be either in the center of the tower, the core of the tower, or at the bottom center of the tower. So go to its anchor point, set bottom. Notice the 3D gizmo is now at the bottom and it's in the center of that tower. And if we zero out the X and the Z, I don't recommend zeroing out the Y, because technically, if it's off by a little bit at the bottom, it'll be okay. We can fine tune that later. It's not a big deal. And now let's go ahead and move this tower over there to the other one, getting things out of the center. And it's totally fine if these towers overlap. We have everything in their own individual group, and we're going to take advantage of these groups even more in a minute. But for now, pause the video. I'm going to apply this to all the buildings and just get them pushed off to the side, and then we can focus on one building in particular. Now, something I'm doing here as well, I'm not zeroing out the X and Z anymore. I was just showing you that it would go to the center of the scene. Once you set that anchor point to the bottom or the center, you can just simply drag that over, and it's going to be in relationship. These X, Y, and Z coordinates are in relationship to the dead center of the scene, and that's what we want here. So here I am finally at building S, and let's go ahead and set that bottom, and let's go ahead and zero out the X and the Z. So that's going to put that building right smack in the middle of the scene. Let's go ahead and frame in building S, and now we're finally ready to work on a building. Now, this is something I wish I knew before I started building my KITBASH scene. My recommendation here is anything you want to tweak on this, it's okay if you don't do it right now, but I recommend doing it right now, and then whatever you have inside of this group, we're going to start putting things inside of this building S group, adding our own pieces to it. And then once we keep it in that group, it's always going to move with it. It'll stay in the same position in relationship to this group. I'm going to go ahead and zoom on in some more. And some things we can go ahead and add to this building right now are going to be some lights, and they're going to be spotlights. And speaking of lights, let me zoom in on one of these little poles here. This is what I did for part of my KITBASH scene. If you notice, we really kind of have two items inside of here. One of the items is going to be this yellowish looking paint. Just bear in mind that's also going to apply to the trash can. Let's try right clicking and detaching the reference. Now, unfortunately here, with the way this is set up, it's not going to detach it from the trash can. So if we come in here and we light up, if we wanted to light up this light with some illuminance, come in here to illuminance, bump it on up, and let's set our color to a green. Notice it's going to light up the trash can, which is fine if you want that. If we zoom out, we also have that same light getting applied to all of these, which is good, but that's not the light I'm talking about. Let's use a spotlight over top of this little post here. Now, bearing in mind our building is at the center of the scene, when we go and add a spotlight, let's go ahead and do that now. And also bear in mind when you come and add this. Now, I think if we have building S selected and we go add a spotlight. Now notice the light is not in the group right now, which is fine. The light's actually over here. And since we can see that with the 3D gizmo, I'm just going to drag it on up some, bring it on over, and we're going to try to put it right over top of this post. We need to rotate this light too, don't we? Let's try 90 degrees. And if that wasn't right, go in the opposite direction, -90, but this is good. So let's drag this on over, and let's just try to center this up over that post. Drag your camera around to get a better view. Now I'm going to tell you, this does not have to be perfect. In that KITBASH scene I made, I don't know how many lights I got in there, probably 50, 60, I'm just thinking off the top of my head. And when you start animating, you're not going to be looking to see if this post is perfectly centered in that light. Probably would move it up a little bit. For that light, I'm going to go down to its color, and I'm going to set that to a green. Now, render shape, don't want that. You can keep it there if you want. Maybe smooth that angle out a little bit, and adjust any of these settings to your liking. Now let's bear in mind this is one of the lights that we have added to the scene. I'm just going to click on building S. I'm going to frame that in again. And basically I just want to get a better view of the other two lights. So for that spotlight we just added, let's duplicate it and let's slide it over to the next one. Again, this doesn't have to be perfect. Duplicate it again. And now we have actual lights on these posts. Now, if you wanted to, for that material, if we go back and find that painted metal, remember how we did have some illuminance applied to that material? We don't have to use that if we don't want to. So set that back down to 1 and we can just change that back to a black. That was its default colors. But what's going to happen with that, again, I mentioned earlier, is that trash can is not going to be lit up anymore. It's just going to have that default yellow color, as you can see right up here. That's what it was originally. Now, if you're messing around with this building, take note we do have some more of those little posts over there, so you can move them over there as well. But let's talk about another light. And the light I'm talking about is this street light right here. I'm going to click on that material to remind myself what color I had it set to. Here's this light signs. Clicking on that material. We had it set to a red. So a couple of options here. We can use a spotlight or a sphere light. It doesn't really matter. But since we've used a spotlight already, let's go ahead and add a sphere light. Now to make sure I don't lose track of where all my lights are, I'm just taking note that I do have those 3 spotlights from these 3 green lights. I'm going to go ahead and add a sphere light. Now that sphere light by default is going to be in the middle of the scene. So I'm going to take that sphere light and move it right around here. Bring it on up. We dial it out a little bit. And I'm actually going to move this sphere light out here onto what will eventually be our street. And maybe I'll move it up some. For that light, let's go down to its settings. I'm going to change that to a red. Maybe not the intensity down. Don't want to render the shape. And now we kind of have that glow coming off what appears to be these lights up here. Now we actually have some light down here at the bottom. Now if you start enabling shadows on a lot of these things, it will make your render time slower. To be quite honest with you, I don't think I have shadows enabled on anything in my animation from those 2 or 3 videos that you have watched. Now, once you get done with the building, and bearing in mind this is in the center of the scene, I'm going to take all of those lights that we have and I'm going to drag them inside of that building S group. That way, whenever we move building S around, let's go ahead and frame this in. If I start moving building S around, check it out. The lights stay with that group. That is freaking awesome. I wish I had done this before I created my first scene. So I've pushed that one off the center of the scene, and let's just grab another one. I'm gonna grab tower 2. I don't know where it is. Let's frame it in. Okay, it's over here. Don't really matter. When you go to set it up, zero out your X, zero out your Z. Let's reframe it. And now notice this tower here is in the middle of the scene. The reason why I recommend doing this is because when you go to add lights, or if you wanted to add other objects, oh heck, let me show you that while I'm thinking about it. I just did Command Z a few times to get that back out of the center of the scene. And what I want to actually find is that building I used at the corner where I had a stoplight. It's this one right here. So I don't know which building that's called. I'm just randomly clicking on it. It is the building large. Just make sure whenever you select a building, you go up to the group itself. And let's zero out the X and the Z. I'm going to reframe that building. And I tell you what, just so I had the distractions out of the way, I'm going to take that building S with those lights we've already added, and I'm just going to slide it on over. All right, that's out of the way. So let's focus on this building now. Now, as I do this, you can see a little bit of that Z fighting or stitching happening right there, and pretty much the street is right on the level of the plane. But in probably part 3, when I start talking about adding a street, creating curbs and whatnot, we will definitely fix that little bit of flickering we have right there. No big deal. Again, as I mentioned earlier, if you just move those slightly offset each other, it will fix that most of the time, or it has for me. So we have this tower here in the center of our scene. I tell you what, just for the sake so we can see it, I'm going to add an ambient light just to light up the scene a little bit more. We'll crank that on up. And the reason why I'm doing that is I want you to notice that even on this tower, and yes, I did do this when I created my scene as well, we had those same little posts, so you can create some spotlights there as well. But back in part 1, we talked about the scale, and we had that scale set up pretty good. And to be quite honest with you, we probably could have went a little bit bigger, but it's okay. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Back in the miscellaneous models in MO2, we have traffic lights. So let's go ahead and add that to our scene. And since we have this tower in the center of our scene, our stoplight is close by, so we can just take it, drag it on over, and boom, now we have a stoplight on the corner. Now to me, I don't know, now that I'm sitting here looking at it, it looks pretty doggone good in terms of size compared to this building. I don't know, maybe my eyes or my camera view was playing tricks on me back when I added this to my scene earlier. Now if you watch that intro video closely, you may have noticed I changed from a red light to a green light. I actually had some sphere lights up here and I was doing some keyframing and whatnot. I'm not going to talk about that in this video because I think this is already getting long enough. But before I leave you, what I recommend doing is taking that traffic light, if you like where it is, just go ahead and take that traffic light. We want to keep that with this large building we have here. So I'm going to take that and drag it up into that group. Dropping it in right there, puts it right at the top. Perfect. So now if we take this building large and we start moving it around, notice that stoplight is moving with it, and that's perfect. And there you have it, some rendering tips, Baby Yoda, organizing your scene, centering those buildings up, adding even more objects to that particular building, keeping all that stuff inside of a group, and whenever you're actually ready to add it and build your scene, then you'll have all those lights and all those extra objects already there ready to go. If you have any questions, leave a comment below. And that's it for this video. I hope it helped.